January 17, 1944. Northern France. The air is a brittle sheet of glass, cold enough to crack steel. Below the low-hanging winter overcast, a line of Opel Blitz trucks crawls along a muddy vein of road toward the Atlantic Wall. The drivers are tired. Their breath mists in the cramped cabs. They believe the clouds are their armor. Then the sky begins to scream. It isn't the high-pitched whine of a Messerschmitt. It is a deep, guttural thrum that vibrates in the chest of every soldier on the ground. Out of the gray mist, a massive, radial engine shadow drops like a falling anvil. It is the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Within seconds, the lead truck is not hit, it is erased. 8.50 caliber machine guns stitch a line of fire across the convoy, turning reinforced steel into confetti. As the smell of cordite and burning rubber fills the valley, the German survivors realize that for the Third Reich, the open road has become a graveyard. The hunter has arrived, and it has no intention of leaving. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt did not begin its life as a ground attack terror. To understand how this 7-ton behemoth came to dominate the low-level airspace of Western Europe, one must look back to the desperate engineering race of the early 1940s. At the time, the United States Army Air Forces were obsessed with altitude. The prevailing doctrine suggested that the coming war in the skies would be won miles above the earth, where the air was thin and the bombers were vulnerable. Alexander Kartveli, the lead designer at Republic Aviation, responded to this need with a plane built around a single, massive component, the General Electric turbo-supercharger. The resulting aircraft was an anomaly. While the British Spitfire was a study in graceful curves and the German Messerschmitt Bf 109 was a lean, predatory needle, the P-47 was a brute. It was the largest, heaviest single-engine fighter ever built at the time. When British pilots first saw the P-47 in 1943, they joked that a pilot could avoid enemy fire simply by unbuckling his harness and running around the inside of the cavernous fuselage. But the size was a byproduct of its incredible power. Beneath the cowling sat the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, a twin-row radial engine capable of churning out 2,000 horsepower. In the early years of the European theater, the Thunderbolt's mission was clear: escort the big friends, the B-17 and B-24 bombers, into the heart of the Third Reich. At 30,000 feet, the P-47 was a king. Its heavy weight allowed it to outdive anything in the Luftwaffe's inventory, and its 8 Browning machine guns could shred a Focke-Wulf 190 in a single burst. However, as the P-51 Mustang began to take over the long-range escort duties, the P-47 was forced to find a new purpose. It was a transition that would prove fatal for the German logistics machine. The transition was born out of necessity. As the Allied High Command looked toward the invasion of Normandy, they realized that the greatest threat to a successful landing wasn't just the bunkers on the beach, but the German army's ability to reinforce those beaches via rail and road. The transportation plan was drafted, a strategic directive to isolate the battlefield by destroying every bridge, locomotive, and supply truck in northern France. The P-47, with its rugged air-cooled engine that could survive hits that would instantly down a liquid-cooled Mustang or Spitfire, was the perfect tool for this dirty, dangerous work. By early 1944, the 9th Air Force was being re-equipped and retrained. Pilots who were used to the clean, clinical dogfights of the stratosphere were now being told to fly at treetop level, dodging church steeples and telephone wires. They were no longer just pilots. They were jug drivers, manning a flying tank that was about to systematically dismantle the infrastructure of an empire. The stage was set for a campaign of aerial interdiction that would rewrite the rules of mechanized warfare. As the spring of 1944 arrived, the German High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, was acutely aware that a storm was gathering across the English Channel. Their strategy for defending Fortress Europe relied heavily on the mobility of their panzer divisions. The German military doctrine of Bugungskrieg, or maneuver warfare, required a functioning railway system and clear roads to shift massive amounts of fuel, ammunition, and men to any point of crisis. However, They had not accounted for the evolution of Allied tactical aviation. The 9th Air Force, stationed across the rolling fields of southern England, was transforming into a specialized tactical weapon. Unlike the heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force that hammered industrial cities from 5 miles up, these P-47 units were being prepared for armed reconnaissance. This was a polite term for a scorched earth policy from the air. The mission was simple. If it moved on wheels or rails, destroy it. If it stayed still and supported the enemy's ability to fight, level it. The scale of the buildup was staggering. Thousands of Thunderbolts were fitted with bomb racks and underwing shackles for M10 rocket launchers. This turned the P-47 from a pure interceptor into a fighter bomber capable of carrying a payload comparable to a light twin-engine bomber. The pilots began practicing a new, terrifying form of attack, the skip bomb and the low-level strafe. They learned to fly so low that their propellers would occasionally clip the tops of French poplars, and the slipstream of their heavy aircraft would blow tiles off the roofs of village houses. On the other side of the lines, the German logistics officers were reporting a disturbing trend. In the months leading up to June, rail traffic in northern France dropped by nearly 60%. The Reichsbahn, the German National Railway, was losing locomotives faster than they could be repaired. Maintenance crews worked frantically under the cover of night, but as soon as the sun rose, the Jabos, the German slang for jag bomber, would reappear. The German soldiers began to refer to the daylight hours as the time of the hunters. This environmental shift changed the very psychology of the German soldier. Movement during the day became a death sentence. To move a single division from the interior of France to the coast, which should have taken 48 hours, was now taking over a week. Units were forced to travel only in the dark, hiding their vehicles under haystacks and camouflage netting as soon as the first light hit the horizon. The P-47 had effectively placed a ceiling on German mobility. Even before a single Allied soldier stepped onto the sand of Omaha or Juno Beach, the Thunderbolt had already begun to win the Battle of Normandy by strangling the German supply lines in their sleep. To fly the P-47 Thunderbolt was to strap oneself into the heart of a 5-ton locomotive. Unlike the cramped, delicate cockpits of the British Spitfire, the Jug offered a spacious, almost industrial workspace. A pilot sat high, shielded by hundreds of pounds of armor plating that could deflect 20mm cannon rounds. The vibration of the 2,800 cubic inch engine was not a sound, but a physical force that rattled the pilot's teeth. Every instrument, the manifold pressure gauge, the tachometer, the fuel flow, spoke of a machine that wanted to consume the sky. In the low-level environment of 1944, the pilot's world was a blur of green hedgerows and gray stone villages, seen through a thick, bulletproof windscreen that was often smeared with the oil of a shredded German truck. The P-47 was a marvel of rugged engineering, designed to absorb a staggering amount of punishment. Its radial engine was its greatest asset in ground attack missions. Unlike liquid-cooled engines, where a single bullet to the radiator would seize the motor in minutes, the air-cooled double wasp could lose several cylinders and still carry the pilot back across the English Channel. Under the wings, the 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns provided a density of fire that was unparalleled. When all 8 fired simultaneously, the recoil was so powerful it could actually slow the aircraft's airspeed. This wasn't a scalpel. It was a sledgehammer, capable of punching through the engine blocks of half-tracks and the thin top armor of Panzer IV tanks. For the German Lancer on the ground, the P-47 was a phantom of destruction. They called it the Schwarz-Tod, the Black Death. German veterans of the Eastern Front, who had survived the horrors of Soviet Sturmovix, remarked that the American pilots were even more relentless. The psychological toll was immense. Drivers developed Jabo glance, a nervous tic where they constantly scanned the horizon even when indoors. A convoy could be moving peacefully one moment, and 30 seconds later, it was a charnel house of exploding fuel drums and screaming horses. The sound of the R-2800 engine became a trigger for immediate, panic flight into the nearest ditch, as the German soldiers realized that their camouflage was rarely enough to fool the eagle-eyed Jug hunters. The P-47's most significant contribution was not the destruction of tanks, but the systematic dismantling of the Reichsbahn, the German state railway. German logistics relied on a massive fleet of steam locomotives to move coal, steel, and soldiers. However, a steam engine is essentially a pressurized bomb. P-47 pilots discovered that a short burst from their 8 machine guns into a locomotive's boiler would cause a catastrophic explosion of high-pressure steam, instantly scalding the crew and rendering the engine a twisted hunk of useless iron. By the summer of 1944, the French countryside was littered with these iron corpses. This surgical destruction created a logistical vacuum. Even if the German army had the tanks and the men, they no longer had the coal or the functional tracks to bring them to the front. Tactically, the P-47 units developed a rhythm that maximized their survivability against intense German flak. They did not loiter over a target. Instead, they utilized a high-speed approach known as the dive and zoom. A flight of 4 Thunderbolts would scream down from 5,000 feet at over 400 miles per hour, discharge their ordnance or a 3-second burst of fire, and then use their massive kinetic energy to climb back into the clouds before the German anti-aircraft gunners could even traverse their weapons. This tactic exploited the P-47's weight, turning its bulk into a weapon of speed. It forced the Germans to realize that even their most sophisticated 88mm flak batteries were often too slow to track a jug that was already 3 miles away by the time the shells detonated. While the P-47 was a hero to the Allied infantry, its role in ground attack carried a heavy moral burden for the pilots. Unlike the high-altitude dogfights where the enemy was a distant machine, ground attack missions were intensely personal. Pilots could see the laundry hanging in the yards of the houses they flew over. They could see the faces of the German drivers leaping from their trucks. Often, strafing runs occurred near French civilian centers, and the collateral damage was a haunting reality. This was a war of attrition where the line between military necessity and human tragedy was as thin as a wing spar. The Thunderbolt pilots lived with the knowledge that their interdiction often meant the destruction of the very villages they were sent to liberate, a psychological weight that defined the grit of the tactical air commands. The true test of the P-47's supremacy over German supply lines arrived in the sweltering heat of August 1944. Following the Allied breakout from the Normandy hedgerows during Operation Cobra, the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army found themselves caught in a collapsing pocket of territory around the town of Falaise. This was the moment the P-47 Thunderbolt transitioned from a tactical nuisance into an instrument of total atmospheric siege. The German forces, desperate to escape an Allied encirclement, were funneled into a narrow corridor, a bottleneck that would become known as the Corridor of Death. The weather, which had hampered Allied air operations for weeks, suddenly cleared. On the morning of August 12th, the 9th Air Force unleashed the full weight of its Thunderbolt groups. For the German soldiers trapped in the pocket, there was no longer any distinction between the front line and the rear echelon. Every road leading east toward the Seine River was packed 3 vehicles deep with Tiger tanks, horse-drawn wagons, and staff cars. The P-47 pilots, flying out of newly captured strip airfields in France, were often over their targets within 10 minutes of takeoff. The slaughter was systematic. The Thunderbolts did not just strafe the columns. They engineered traffic jams of fire. By destroying the lead and rear vehicles of a convoy, the Jug pilots effectively pinned hundreds of men and machines in place. The .50 caliber rounds, firing at a combined rate of nearly 100 bullets per second, turned the thin-skinned transport trucks into sieves. When the trucks carried ammunition, the resulting secondary explosions leveled nearby trees and buildings. German commanders reported that the noise of the radial engines was so constant that it became a form of psychological torture, driving seasoned veterans to abandon their functional vehicles and flee into the woods at the mere sound of a distant hum. By mid-August, the P-47s had achieved something rarely seen in the history of warfare: the total paralysis of a modern industrial army. The German supply lines were not just cut, they were obliterated. Panzer divisions were running out of fuel while the tankers were only miles away, simply because the P-47s had turned the roads into impassable mounds of charred metal and dead livestock. The juggernaut had created a vacuum of command and control, leaving the once mighty Wehrmacht to rot in the sun of the French countryside. The climax of the Thunderbolts campaign reached its fever pitch at the Seine River crossings. By August 19, 1944, the remnants of the German army were making a desperate, panicked dash for the river, hoping to put a water barrier between themselves and the encroaching Allied armor. However, the P-47s had already anticipated this move. The bridges at places like Mantes Gassecourt and Vernon became the focal points of a relentless aerial bombardment. Any bridge left standing by the heavy bombers was finished off by the Jugs in terrifying low-level skip-bombing runs. One specific engagement on August 25th illustrated the P-47's absolute dominance. A massive German retreat column, including elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, was caught in the open near the town of Chambois. The Thunderbolts arrived in waves, orchestrated by forward air controllers FACs on the ground, often fellow pilots in tanks or jeeps using VHF radios to talk their comrades onto targets. This was the birth of modern air-land integration. The P-47s didn't just drop bombs, they acted as precision artillery. When a German Panther tank attempted to duel with an American Sherman, a P-47 would scream down from the clouds, placing a 500-pound bomb directly on the Panther's thin rear decking. The carnage was so absolute that the Allied ground forces, when they finally reached the scene, were nauseated by what they found. Miles of road were covered in a carpet of destruction. Thousands of horses, still harnessed to supply wagons, lay dead alongside the burned-out shells of the Reich's finest armored vehicles. The German supply lines hadn't just been cut, they had been ground into the soil. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, touring the area shortly after, remarked that it was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying bodies. The turning point was no longer a single battle, but a realization within the German high command. The Luftwaffe was dead, and the P-47 owned the daylight. The German soldier was now fighting a two-dimensional war against a three-dimensional enemy. This total air-to-ground supremacy meant that even if Germany could manufacture more tanks and more fuel, they could never move them to the front. The P-47 had effectively shortened the war by months, stripping the Wehrmacht of its most potent weapon, its mobility, and leaving it a static, dying animal in the face of the Allied advance. The immediate aftermath of the P-47's rampage across France was written in the cold, hard data of industrial ruin. By the time the dust settled on the Falaise pocket and the subsequent race to the German border, the 9th Air Force compiled a tally of destruction that seemed almost hyperbolic. In the month of August 1944 alone, Thunderbolt pilots claimed the destruction or damage of nearly 3,000 German tanks and armored vehicles, along with over 10,000 trucks and transport wagons. But the most devastating metric was the annihilation of the rail network. Over 900 locomotives lay in twisted heaps of scrap metal across the French countryside, their boilers pierced by the relentless .50 caliber fire of the Jugs. For the German military, the loss of these supply lines triggered a cascading failure of their entire defensive strategy. Divisions that were supposed to be at full strength arrived at the front with only a fraction of their heavy equipment, having abandoned their tanks on the roadsides for lack of fuel or spare parts. The Red Lion of the 12th SS Panzer Division, for instance, saw its mobility reduced to a crawl, its logistical tail hacked to pieces before it could even engage Allied armor in a meaningful way. The sheer volume of equipment left behind was so vast that it created a secondary problem for the advancing Allies. The roads were so choked with German wreckage that American engineers had to use bulldozers to clear juggernaut-made traffic jams just to keep their own supplies moving forward. Beyond the physical wreckage, the aftermath revealed a total breakdown in the German reinforcement system. The Wehrmacht was no longer a cohesive, mechanized force. It had been forced back into a primitive state. High-ranking German officers captured during the retreat spoke with a mixture of awe and resentment about the Thunderbolt weather. They noted that their tactical decisions were no longer based on the position of Allied tanks, but on the presence of the sun. If the sky was clear, the German army was paralyzed. If it was cloudy, they could breathe. This environmental dependency shattered the German soldiers' confidence in his leadership, as it became clear that the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht had no answer for the 8-gun terror that haunted their every move. As the Allied armies surged toward the Rhine, the true psychological cost of the P-47's dominance began to manifest in the German ranks. The Jabos had not just destroyed machines. They had broken the spirit of the German motorization. Verifiable reports from the era describe a phenomenon where German crews would abandon perfectly functional Panther or Tiger tanks at the mere sight of a P-47 flight circling overhead. The fear was rational. The pilots had become so proficient at skip bombing that the thickest frontal armor was irrelevant. A 500-pound bomb skipping under the chassis or landing on the thin engine grating meant a fiery death from which there was no escape. The logistical collapse also forced the German army into a desperate, regressive shift toward horse-drawn transport. By late 1944, the once vaunted Blitzkrieg force was more reminiscent of the Napoleonic era than a modern mechanized army. This shift was a direct result of the P-47's systematic hunting of fuel trucks. Without the Betriebsstoff, the lifeblood of the panzers, the German military machine quite literally ground to a halt. Statistics recovered from German quartermaster records showed that by September, fuel deliveries to the Western Front had dropped by 80%. The P-47 hadn't just cut the supply lines, it had bled the enemy dry. In the halls of Allied command, the success of the P-47 led to a fundamental shift in air doctrine. The Tactical Air Command was no longer a secondary support wing. It was now recognized as a primary strike force. General George S. Patton, often critical of other branches, became one of the Thunderbolt's biggest advocates, famously demanding that P-47s be tied directly to his armored columns. The aftermath of the 1944 campaign proved that air power could do more than just bomb factories. It could isolate a battlefield so completely that the enemy's superior weaponry became nothing more than static iron targets. This realization would form the bedrock of Western military strategy for the next 80 years, ensuring that no modern army would ever again attempt a major offensive without first securing the thunderbolt of the skies. The war in the skies is often remembered for the graceful arcs of dogfighting fighters or the somber majesty of heavy bomber streams. Yet, history has a way of burying the most brutal truths in the mud of the low-level battlefield. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was the ultimate realization of industrial-age warfare, a machine that lacked the elegance of its peers, but possessed a terrifying, singular efficiency. It was the hammer that shattered the spine of the Third Reich, proving that a war of movement cannot be won if the ground itself is no longer safe. When we look back at the scorched roads of France and the twisted iron of the Reichsbahn, we see more than just the debris of a defeated army. We see the birth of the modern era of air-land integration. The Jug drivers who flew through a wall of flak at 300 miles per hour redefined the soldiers' relationship with the sky. They proved that the most sophisticated logistics network in the world could be dismantled by a pilot with enough armor, 8 machine guns, and the courage to fly low enough to see the enemy's face. Today, the Thunderbolt remains a symbol of rugged persistence. It reminds us that victory in conflict is rarely just about who has the fastest plane or the biggest tank. It is about the ability to sustain the fight. By severing the veins of the German war machine, the P-47 ensured that the heart of the Wehrmacht would eventually stop beating. It was a victory of grit over grace, and its legacy lives on in every aircraft that has since taken up the mantle of protecting the troops on the ground from the terrors of the sky.